proposal on the day that our budget was due to the council. And we've done it in the mayor council breakfast. So this is just a modified emergency operation where we are doing it today, and as well as inviting the chairman of the council to join us, and members of the council are joining remotely. Tomorrow I will present to the council in a hearing called by the chairman, where I will speak about some specifics and answer the council's questions. So this morning our plan is to start with the chairman, who will give his briefing to the press about the council's meeting tomorrow. I'll make a few comments and then turn it to Rashad Young, our city administrator, and Jenny Reed, our budget director, to talk specifically about what's in our budget. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and good morning to everybody. So this is the same process that we followed the last couple of months with regard to the day before a legislative meeting. I joined the mayor's press conference to do the standard press conference that I do before a legislative meeting. I'm going to speak to that. I know everybody is here because they front and center want to hear about the legislative meeting tomorrow, not the budget. But we do have a meeting tomorrow where we are going to be voting on an emergency bill that actually consolidates and does some polishing to the emergency bills the council's previously adopted, as well as include some new measures. Just to give you a sense of what the council has been considering since the beginning of this pandemic or the emergency, is revisions to our labor laws, particularly with regard to unemployment insurance, and there are no new changes for tomorrow. Proposals to help with business and economic development, such as the micro-grant program we authorized in March, consumer protection and regulation, housing and tenant protections, and so forth. The legislation tomorrow, as I said, is a consolidation and some refinement of what we've already adopted, but also will have some new provisions, such as requiring payment plans for utility customers who've been impacted by the economic situation around the emergency, voluntary guardianship for minors, clarifications to public benefits, quorum requirements for the Rental Housing Commission, prohibitions on discharging long-term care residents, a food access study so that we have a better sense of what has happened with food access, particularly in lower income neighborhoods. The measure tomorrow I proposed will refine the council's recess, which typically is 2 months, and instead will be reduced to August 1st to Labor Day. So those are some of the new provisions that are in the legislation for tomorrow. Other provisions that are receiving some revisions or improvements deal with mortgage deferrals, debt collection, credit reporting, rental payment plans, both for residential and commercial, limitations on foreclosures, and so forth. So that's the primary item of business for tomorrow, which is an additional meeting which will follow the Committee of the Whole. As the Mayor noted, we are having a hearing tomorrow. The Committee of the Whole will be having the hearing where the mayor will formally present the budget, her proposed budget for fiscal year 2021, as well as the supplemental, which is the revisions to the current year's budget. And that'll be a council hearing. I think it's the first council hearing that we are having since we went to our revised or virtual operations. Actually, the hearing tomorrow will be remote. So I think, Mayor, you may be in this building while I'm over in the Wilson building, and members will be participating through a online or virtual platform. I'm happy to take questions if there are any with regard to what we're doing with the emergency or anything else before the council. And if there are no questions, then we'll turn to you, Madam Mayor. And if there are questions later, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and all the members of the council. I want to once again thank you for your support and collaboration throughout the district's response to this public health emergency. These are certainly extraordinary times, and we know that many in our community have made tremendous sacrifices. I also want to thank my team, Rashad Young, the city administrator, and Jenny Reed, our budget director, as well as their teams, and all of my agency directors who have worked very hard to turn this budget around after nearly completing one budget just before I had to declare a public health emergency. I also want to thank the Chief Financial Officer, Jeffrey DeWitt, for working with us on his budget. Jeff's responsibility, of course, is certifying revenues and certifying that the budget is balanced. I want to thank Jeff and his team for the work that they have done with us. And certainly there is no small task under these circumstances in building the budget. We've just been reflecting recently that our jobs right now, our response to this pandemic, building the budget, focusing on our reopening process, and focusing on the general operations of our city that have nothing to do with COVID-19, but must still operate without a hitch. And so we are doing that in modified operations, both DC government, DC council, and most aspects of our economy. So I want to thank everybody for the sacrifices and hard work that they put into this. As you can see, this budget, or you will see that this budget really reflects our community's priorities. It is a balanced budget that makes big investments in our residents, that reflects those shared values, and also sets up the district for an efficient recovery. We know that in addition to the public health emergency, the pandemic has quickly created a second emergency, and that's a national economic crisis. The impacts on our revenues have been significant. The CFO came to one of these briefings several weeks ago to talk in some detail about the revenue losses that have resulted. Already, we are faced with a loss of more than $700 million in resources in both this fiscal year, FY20, and the fiscal year that begins on October the 1st, FY21. On top of those losses, we have nearly spent $200 million of our funds in response and recovery, and those costs will continue to grow by the hundreds of millions of dollars in the coming weeks and months. And just as this pandemic has forced our residents and businesses to make very difficult spending decisions, DC government has had to do the same thing. But I want to be clear. While this is not the budget that I expected to send to the council earlier this year, it is a budget that I am proud of and that the city can be proud of. It is still a budget that reflects our shared values and priorities. One of our priorities in putting this budget together and all the decisions that we've made is that we would maintain our core government functions and focus on the health and well businesses. We have focused in this budget on how we maximize our resources for the immediate public health response to COVID-19. We focused on how we can address the hardest hit by the COVID-19 public health emergency. We have also invested in maintaining stability for the district's workforce. And we have focused on not losing ground on any of the key district priorities that we have been able to make tremendous progress on. You will continue to see very significant investments in schools, housing, and healthcare. We, of course, are fortunate that we came into this public health emergency in a very strong financial standing. You may remember that it was only in January, earlier this year, that we celebrated the fact that we hit 60 days of cash reserves, a good government milestone that let everybody know that we were managing our resources appropriately and investing in the things that was making our city strong. That milestone was a long time in coming and one that taxpayers and city leaders worked diligently over many years to achieve. Along with achieving a AAA bond rating, having a fully funded pension and retiree health plan, and we ended, as I mentioned, the year with 60 days in cash reserves. So before this pandemic hit, we had already achieved a very fast recovery from a federal government shutdown. We continue to attract people and businesses to our city. We have a strong real estate market, increasing wages, and we have been increasingly diversifying DC jobs without such a significant focus on the federal government. So before I hand it over to the city administrator to talk about our budget in detail, I just know that we have been very fortunate in our city to build the type of strong reserves, the type of fiscal discipline that has allowed us to get there, but more than that, work together to have a strong set of values and guiding principles that have guided our budget and our work together. So we all agree, for example, that our public schools must remain a top priority and that affordable housing is key to a more equitable city. We also agree, as we watch COVID-19 disproportionately affect our communities of color, that we can't wait for this pandemic to be over to do better. Several weeks ago, I charged the Reopen DC Advisory Group with anchoring their efforts in 4 values: health, opportunity, prosperity, and equity. So you will see those values reflected here in our fiscal 2021 budget. So with that, I want to turn it over to City Administrator Young to talk in some detail about this budget. This is a longer, relatively long presentation, and purposefully so. We want to talk to you about the district's unique budget and how we built it and how we will move forward together. Thanks, CA.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Good morning, members of the council and those in the briefing room. As the mayor indicated, our budget is unique. We are unique across the country from states and localities about how we construct our budget. And there are really 3 component parts to that process. One is our annual operating budget, which we will be presenting and mostly talking about today for fiscal year 2021. But really what is unique for us is that we also have to have a 4-year financial plan. And so we build a financial plan for the fiscal years 2021 through 2024 that has to be balanced in each and every year. And so our CFO forecasts revenues across this 4-year horizon. He also forecasts expenses, and in each of those years we have to be in balance. We also prepare a 6-year capital plan, and that plan covers fiscal years 21 through fiscal year 26. This is so important because it means that revenue declines that we see today have a multi-year impact on our budget because of the 4-year planning construct. How we use reserves is really an important part of our strategy in how we attacked this budget and put together this budget given the loss of resources that the mayor talked about earlier. So I want to spend just a moment explaining the reserve funds and how we're using them during this unprecedented period. So the district has 4 reserve funds designed to provide flexibility during financial times. 3 of those reserves are in use right now. So the cash flow reserve, which is $775 million, that's the first box here, provides for daily operating cash to pay our employees and meet our contractual payments and daily supplies. Our cash receipts are uneven. So we receive property tax, for example, twice a year, in April and then in the fall and September. And so the money that the district receives into its coffers doesn't come over 12 equal pay installments over a given fiscal year. And because our cash receipts are uneven, we use the cash flow reserve, or the CFO uses the cash flow reserve to pay the bills and the expenses for the district on an ongoing basis while we wait to receive cash at various points of time in the year. And so this reserve is really how we manage our liquidity. In years past, we've had to borrow short term to have enough cash to pay our obligations. But because we've been able to build up our cash balances, and the mayor talked about the 60 days of cash that we have when we started this pandemic, we're able to then use this cash flow reserve to manage our cash receipts or cash expenses throughout the year. The second reserve is the contingency cash reserve. It's $299 million. And if you see the bar to the right of that box, we have drawn significantly on the contingency cash reserve. Its use is for unanticipated and non-recurring needs, and we've got to pay that reserve back by law within 1 to 2 years. Of the $299 million in contingency cash reserve, we have used $236.4 million, mostly for our COVID-19 response. So we're drawing on that reserve to front the expenses for things like PPE, for medical surge, for ventilators and equipment that we need, for the food program that we're providing, where we're giving groceries and food to young people and families on a daily basis at school sites. All of those expenses that we have paid for contact tracing. We started 130 employees this week to begin contact tracing. We're using the contingency cash to pay for that expense. Much of this will be reimbursed by the federal government through several different grant opportunities or formula grants that we are receiving, but we're expending that from the contingency cash. The third reserve that we have is the Fiscal Stabilization Reserve. It's $213 million. It may be used to cover revenue shortfalls that we experience in the district. We're using all of the Fiscal Stabilization Reserve to help balance the 2021 budget. And so we're drawing completely on that reserve. We intend to pay it back in the 4-year financial plan. Shows that we pay this reserve, the stabilization fund, back in fiscal years 23 and in 24. But we're going to draw that reserve now to help us balance in 21. Our fourth reserve is the emergency reserve, which is for extraordinary, unanticipated, and non-recurring needs. And we have not used the emergency reserve, and we don't anticipate using that reserve because we're using so much of the other 3 that I detailed below. And so that just gives you a flavor of what we have available for our reserves and what we're using and why. In terms of the cash that we have in total in the district, we use the term fund balance, but the way to think about this is how much is in our bank account. There's $3.3 billion in our fund balance. A significant portion of that I've already talked about, and that's the area in the orange in this donut, the Fiscal Stabilization and Cash Flow Reserve, and then the blue, the Emergency and Contingency Reserves. Those are the 4 reserves that I walked through on the previous slide that we are using in some form, or most of which we are using in some form or fashion in terms of how we balance. Much of the rest of that donut is not available to be spent for general operating expenses. For example, 17% of that resource, the debt service reserve, is $563 million. We must have that available to pay our debt service expenses. Prior year surpluses of $488 million. We are using a portion of that, and I'll talk about that in a future slide in terms of how we're balancing the budget. The dedicated tax funds of $488 million. These are things like our WMATA operating and capital and hospital funds. Those are reserved for specific activities, and we can't use that to close the revenue deficit that we see. The Housing Production Trust Fund and the PAYGO amounts, we are using a portion of those reserves to balance that budget, and we'll talk about that in the future slide. So of what is in the bank, of the $3.3 billion, we are using as much as we responsibly can and we legally can to help address the revenue deficits and the resource deficits that we're experiencing in the district. When we think about our budget process, and many of you who've been around us for a while have seen this 4 phases that we're in the preparation phase, where just before we release the budget, we have community input. We had our budget engagement forums, our agency inputs, and just before the mayor intended to release the budget, the pandemic really showed in the District of Columbia. And so before the mayor released the budget, we had the public emergency that was declared on March the 11th. And April 24th, the CFO came back with new revenue estimates that showed these dramatic declines in our resource base. And we are now at the point where we are ready to present the council the budget, and we'll go to the legislative phase where we are presenting the budget to the council. There will be public hearings. The council will vote on the budget. The CFO will re-estimate our revenues in August to see where we are as compared to his April 24th estimate. That will tell us if we are on track from his April 24th estimate, or if there are additional adjustments that we will have to make as a result of what's happening in the district economically. Once the council votes and we go through congressional review, we're in the execution phase and then the accountability phase, where we hold agencies accountable for budget execution, and the council then proceeds with its oversight. In terms of what this budget is for fiscal year 2021, our gross funds budget is $16.7 billion. And this chart shows just where those sources are. About half of that are local sources, and that's what I'll be spending most of this conversation talking about. What is in the local budget, that's $8.5 billion. Our federal grants and Medicaid is $3.6 billion. Enterprise funds are $3 billion. The enterprise funds are the area that we've seen the greatest growth between last year and this year, and that is primarily due to the resources that are in the paid family leave account, which is at $304 million today, and the UI Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund, which is at a little over $600 million today. So those two funds and those two sets of resources is what drives the change between what this budget was in fiscal year 20 and what it is proposed to be in fiscal year 21. The other categories of funds in terms of special revenue is $754 million, dedicated taxes at $518 million, and then federal payments and a small source of private resources. Our total uses have followed what they typically do in years past. Our greatest expenditures in the gross fund budget is for human support services at just over $5 billion, followed by public education at $3.1 billion, enterprise funds at $3 billion, and you can see the other categories so listed. When we talk about the local funds budget, again, which is where we'll be spending most of the conversation today, that budget is at $8.5 billion. Our greatest expenditure follows historical patterns here. Public education is our greatest expenditure at $2.6 billion. In the local funds, human support services at $1.9 billion, then public safety at nearly $1.3 billion, and you can see the other categories so listed. When we look at the budget growth over a year, and we look at what has been the growth of the actual expenditures in a given fiscal year versus where we are today, the revised budget through the supplemental that we're also providing to the council at $8.3 billion is, as compared to fiscal year 21, is a growth rate of 1.8%. So the 2021 budget is 1.8% higher than what the fiscal year 20 revised budget will be. And that just gives you a sense of how those budgets have compared to prior years over time from 2015. In terms of our capital budget, our 6-year plan is a $7.9 billion expenditure. The sources of those funds are the same as they usually are, with the greatest source of funds being from our GO and IT bonds, our tax-exempt bonds. So our debt issuances represent $3.5 billion of this 7.9. Our PAYGO, which is cash capital, is at $1.6 billion. Federal grants at $1.1 billion, and then you can see the other sources that are listed. In terms of our uses, our largest expenditure in the capital budget is for the Department of Transportation or infrastructure-related projects at $2.7 billion, then followed by our capital investments in WMATA at $1.7 billion, then our DCPS for all of our building modernizations and renovations at $1.4 billion. Then you can see the other categories that are listed there. When we talk about why 20 and 21 was so challenging for us, the revenue lost in fiscal year 20, which is the fiscal year that we're in now, was $722 million. And so that means we had to make adjustments in our current fiscal year to reduce that spending to come into balance. For fiscal year 21, that revenue loss is $774 million. These are revenue losses based upon what the CFO had originally projected those revenue amounts to be for those fiscal years. So we expected revenue of $8.4 billion in fiscal year 20, and now we have revenue of $7.7 billion. We expected revenue in fiscal 21 and built a budget according to that revenue of $8.69 billion, and then had to make adjustments down to $7.9 billion for fiscal year 21. So what does it mean to cut $700 million from the operating budget? So hypothetically, if we were to cut the combined local budgets for the Departments of Human Services, Disability Services, and Parks and Recreation, we would come close to, but not equal to, the amount of money that we had to reduce in this budget. Similarly, in the capital budget, because our revenue is less, then our borrowing capacity is also less, which means we had to cut $1.2 billion from the capital budget. So hypothetically speaking, if we cut every project for DDOT and DCPS and cut fleet for 3 years, it would get to $1.2 billion. Or if we cut all the DMPED capital projects, the new hospital, and all of our fleet for 3 years, that's where we get to $1.2 billion. So that just gives you some and we didn't do that, by the way. So that says hypothetically. So that just gives you some context for what it means to make these kinds of reductions. So how did we get there? From a macro perspective, we got there from using all of the financial tools and resources and healthy resources and reserves that we had. So we used, in balancing this budget, these two budgets, fiscal 20 and 21, all of the 2019 surplus. So there was projected to be an additional $322 million that came from the close of fiscal year 2019. Because our cash reserves were full, that $322 million by law was split between PAYGO Capital and the Housing Production Trust Fund. That's where those resources ended up. We have taken those resources from those two areas and dedicated them to closing our gap. As I mentioned earlier, we used all of the fiscal stabilization reserve, and we also reversed the Evans Amendment to capture additional revenue from the ballpark stadium bond defeasance. So what this means is there was a law passed that former council member Evans was the leader of and champion of, that took excess revenue generated from the ballpark to pay off the bonds related to the ballpark faster. So we would pay them off faster by excess revenue that was generated by the economic activity around the ballpark. Instead of paying that debt faster, we are going to capture those resources and revert back to the original schedule of defeasing those bonds, which means that instead of paying them off 1 year earlier, we'll pay them off when they were originally scheduled to be paid, and that generates $105 million that we can use to help balance the budget. It doesn't change any payments or tax liabilities for existing businesses. It simply reverts to the original schedule to defease those bonds, and we will pay them off on time instead of 1 year earlier. We also anticipate $80 million to come from bond refinancing. Because we're a AAA credit, because we have strong reserves, we have the opportunity to refinance at lower rates. We expect to capture $80 million through that process, and we have used those resources to balance in fiscal years 21 and 22. The other thing that we have done to balance across all 4 years of the plan is to assume no pay growth in the out years of the plan. So we have frozen pay by virtue of this budget recommendation for all district government employees, represented and non-represented, in fiscal years 21 through fiscal years 24. So to freeze pay means that there would be no COLAs in the budget, assumed in the budget, for any employee in district government throughout the financial plan period, and then that generates a savings of $250 million that we used to balance across 4 years. If we look a little more specifically at fiscal years 20 and 21, this gives you a sense of how specifically we try to address those deficits. So in 20, we made $190 million in reductions to agency budgets, mostly through the hiring and spending freeze that the mayor instituted in March. We shifted $214 million in eligible local funds onto the COVID state fund. This is the $495 million grant, which represents a partial payment to the district for the money that we should receive for the COVID fund. And we used $267 million in prior year surpluses, including a portion of that PAYGO that I referred to earlier, and other financial tools to balance in fiscal year 20. These are things that we did on top of additional investments that were required in 20, namely $80 million in increases for union pay agreements in fiscal year 20. So remember, pay is frozen in fiscal 21 and forward, but we have obligations that we paid in fiscal year 20 for current union contracts that we had to account for. We had increases in leases in fiscal year 20 and other commitments, including the increased need for housing assistance, schools, and additional Medicaid, since we are seeing more people, because of the pandemic, that are out of work, shift to Medicaid for their health insurance. So there was some puts and takes, if you will, in fiscal year 20. In fiscal year 21, we made reductions of $166 million in agency budgets to also include cutting pay increases. We shifted another $38 million of eligible expenses onto the COVID fund, and we used $213 million, all of the fiscal stabilization fund, and $320 million from prior year surpluses, including those surpluses I referred to from PAYGO and HPTF, to help us balance in 21. In the capital plan, we cut $1.2 billion by removing and shifting projects that were not ready to go forward on their previously scheduled timelines. So if a project was funded in fiscal year 21 but wouldn't be ready to move forward until 22, in some cases we shifted those projects 1 year forward and captured that savings to help us balance. Our focus in the CIP was threefold. One, to maintain all the timelines for existing projects when those projects were able to deliver on time. And that includes keeping all of our school and recreation center modernizations in their existing places in the CIP. Also funding the K Street Transitway and the Benning Road streetcar extension. Our second focus was to keep core infrastructure and assets in a state of good repair. So we kept funding for streets and sidewalks and alleys and fleet as critical priorities in the CIP, and tried to align those investments to what CARS, our capital asset replacement system, suggests needs to be funded and invested for those assets. And we prioritize immediate maintenance and safety concerns. So there's funding in the capital budget for improvements to the Daly building, for the New Beginnings campus, which is run by the Department of Youth and Rehabilitative Services. There's capital investments for improvements at DC Jail and at St. Elizabeth's Behavioral Hospital. So despite the challenges that we have, there's still $8.5 billion in local funds and $16.7 billion in gross funds to invest, and we have been very focused on investing in education, healthcare, and housing. And also a critical part of our strategy in building this budget is to leverage our federal resources that will allow us to both respond to what we're seeing as immediate needs for the COVID-19 public health crisis, but also invest in our recovery and our reopen. And so in order to do that effectively, we absolutely and urgently need the additional $750 million that are owed to DC from the federal government as we move and hopefully move soon to recovery and relief efforts and responding efforts in the district. So let's talk about what some of our specific investments are. The mayor is recommending a 3% increase to the uniform per student funding formula to support DCPS in our charter schools for a total of $1.92 billion to serve 98,000 public school students and charter school students. Continued expansion of IT devices and supports, and expansion of school-based mental health programs through federal resources, $6 million for the IT supports, $1.5 million for mental health. $90.3 million for programs and services at UDC, and $108 million in capital improvements for university facilities. There's $1 million in the budget to help open the new MLK Library, and $37.2 million for a new Parkland's Turner Library and Chevy Chase Public Library. There's $75 million in capital funds to support 17 schools and the creation of 540 new early child care seats and 180 pre-K seats. There's $1.4 billion in the capital budget to expand and modernize 41 schools, including $80 million to open a new Bard High School Early College at the site of the Malcolm X Opportunity Center. $56 million to open a new Foxhall Elementary School in Ward 3 to really help with the overcrowding of elementary schools that are in the Wilson feeder pattern. $6 million to create new space for Early Childhood Development Center and expand pre-K seats at Amadon Bowen Elementary School. $23 million for a new expansion at Barnard Elementary, and $27.8 million for 5 new schools through the PACE process, those being Tyler and Seaton, Whittier, Ketchum, and Burville are the 5 the new PACE elementary schools for modernization in the CIP. $204 million in capital investments over 6 years to renovate 26 parks and recreation facilities, including $71.3 million to continue or create projects modernizing 6 rec centers across 5 wards, including Theodore Hagen's Cultural Center in Ward 5, the Therapeutic Recreation Center in Ward 7, the Tacoma Aquatic Center roof replacement, and a new pool on the site of Walter Reed in Ward 4. $41 million to improve and preserve recreation facilities in all 8 wards, including investments in ADA compliance, access and security, HVAC, IT infrastructure, swimming pool replacements, and $1.5 million to convert Jefferson Field to turf to improve usability and field conditions. Also in education, we're really excited that this budget recommends creating a permanent home for Excel Academy at its current location in the Bernie building, and investing over $52 million to renovate Spingarn High School to create a long-term home for the DC Infrastructure Academy. Our thought here is that the Infrastructure Academy will move from the Wilkinson location by 2024, and Wilkinson would be surplus to the charter sector, and we're also are looking to explore a charter tenant to co-locate at the Spingarn site with the Infrastructure Academy. In the healthcare space, the mayor's talked about this several weeks ago about our investments in the health space and really focusing on health disparities and the inequitable outcomes for health and for residents of the District of Columbia. This budget formally reflects those investments that we talked about earlier, with $4.2 million to support 5 centers of excellence at Howard University Hospital that really focuses on areas that are disparately impacting the residents of District of Columbia in areas like sickle cell and maternal health, co-occurring disorders, violence prevention, for example. And $25 million to support the development of a new Howard Hospital to be completed by 2026, with future tax abatements of $225 million over a 20-year period to support the construction of a new hospital on Howard University's campus. $4.8 million to implement recommendations from the Mayor's Commission on Healthcare Systems Transformation, which really focuses on a number of areas to include reducing reliance on emergency care and improving health outcomes for populations who are disproportionately impacted by certain health diseases. $35 million in additional funds to support increased enrollment in Medicaid as a result of the public health emergency, and $1.4 million in grants for developmental disability service providers, and increased Stevie Sellos fees to provide intermediate care facilities pay increases for their staff. And also $365 million for a new state-of-the-art hospital and ambulatory center on the campus of St. Elizabeth's. In the affordable housing space, the mayor maintains a $100 million commitment in the Housing Production Trust Fund in fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 21 to create 1,000 new units of affordable housing, adds $1 million to the Preservation Fund in fiscal 21 to leverage a total of $4 million for that fund. $76 million across 21 and 22 for a new DASH fund that supports the Housing Authority to rehabilitate and refresh their portfolio. Of that $76 million, $40 million is allocated for the investments in the state of good repair, and then $36 million to continue to support the new communities initiatives. $19.5 million to provide affordable home ownership for residents through the HPAP Home Purchase Assistance Program and the Employer Assistant Housing Program, and then $15.6 million in anticipated funds, federal funds, to provide increased rental assistance for nonprofits, project delivery support. $5 million investment in Homeward DC for new permanent supportive housing units, and $7.8 million to open ward-based emergency family housing, and then $35 million to expand and renovate our permanent and temporary supportive housing. In the public safety space, there's additional investments to expand the MPD cadet program, $300,000 for public health emergency preparedness, $86 million for new emergency response vehicles, $4.5 million to buy cardiac life-saving equipment for EMS personnel, $2 million to continue to add correctional officers at the DC jail, which will help us reduce overall costs and reduce overtime and burnout for those employees that are working at the jail, and $48 million in capital funds to upgrade critical systems at the jail, and $200,000 for a new consumer case management system at DCRA to improve their code violation enforcement as recommended by the independent review of the Kennedy Street fire. In jobs and economic opportunity, there's $7 million for Great Streets and Neighborhood Prosperity Fund, $3.7 million for Main Streets, $4.5 million for Clean Teams. We continue the Aspire program at $250,000, which helps returning citizens start their own businesses, $250,000 to assist small businesses with their participation in online wagering program, expanded access to DC Opportunity accounts, and then $75.5 million for investments in McMillan, $122.6 million for infrastructure development at St. Elizabeth's, and $14.5 million to continue progress at Hill East. In the transportation and environment category, there's $467 million to improve the condition of district streets, sidewalks, and alleys, $113 million for the streetcar, including the extension to Benning Road, Metro Station, and $117 million for the completion of the K Street Transitway. $17.8 million for bus priority and efficiency initiatives, $6.5 million for improvements to the circulator, $2.8 million to continue our efforts around dedicated towing services and bike lane enforcement during rush hour, which supports our Vision Zero efforts. $40 million to help us continue to clean up the Anacostia River, $53 million for tree planting in our urban forestry efforts, and then resources to install new electric vehicle charging stations, and then $1.7 billion to support capital infrastructure upgrades at Metro. In the government operations category, there's $4.3 million to fund fair elections, $1 million to continue our statehood education campaign, $10 million in capital funds, as I mentioned earlier, for planning and renovation work at the historic Daly Building. $2 million to support our cybersecurity preparedness and incident response capabilities, and then the creation of an online marketplace to help us with our third-party construction and inspection process. I want to spend a little bit of time of talking about federal assistance and how the federal assistance has flowed to the district, how we are using some of it to support the needs of the districts in response and recovery. So when we look at federal assistance, there are really two kinds of assistance that are coming to us, or two periods that the assistance is coming. One, in the emergency response period, and we're using federal assistance to help us with increased demand for benefits, for medical surge, to buy personal protective equipment, to run our operations at the Emergency Operations Center. During the recovery period, we will have costs that include economic and workforce recovery, health and human services recovery, education recovery, cultural and natural resources recovery, and more. At this point, the district government and residents and businesses are estimated to receive a total of $3.9 billion in federal response and recovery. The vast majority of that passes through as direct assistance to businesses, hospitals, and other entities. So $3.2 billion of the $3.9 billion shows up as direct assistance to businesses. I think we may have lost the slide. Direct assistance to businesses, to hospitals, $130 million, $2.4 million to businesses, and then there's other resources that go to WMATA, payments directly to residents through programs like SNAP and LIHEAP. Nearly 725 of that $3.9 billion comes to the district government through broad relief funds like the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is the down payment of the resources we are due from the federal government. We have received $495 million from the Coronavirus Relief Fund, and we need the additional $750 million from that fund. There are also specific increases to grants like the Community Development Block Grant within district agencies to allow them to expand services. The cost of responding to COVID-19 are substantial and growing. That's why we really need all of those resources given to every other state to be able to respond holistically to those impacts. When we look at the federal assistance and the money that we have allocated and spent to date, it is significant and vast. And so some of these represent resources that have come from the federal government to the benefit directly of residents, like the unemployment insurance payments, both from our unemployment insurance fund and the additional resources provided by the federal government. $248 million in uninsurance payments have been paid to more than 54,000 residents since March the 13th. More than 400,000 meals have been provided to children and families at meal sites across the district since March the 16th, and we estimate to continue to serve between 50 and 55,000 meals weekly going forward. We've invested $6.8 million for emergency SNAP benefits to over 35,000 current DC SNAP households who are not receiving the maximum benefit. $26 million of pandemic electronic benefit transfers for food assistance, and another 17 for 40,000 families who are not receiving SNAP, and another 17,000 families who with eligible children currently on SNAP. Nearly 300,000 meals delivered to more than 6,400 seniors since March the 11th, 9,300 laptops and devices, and nearly 4,000 hotspots delivered to support students' remote learning. And then we have delayed income tax payments for individuals until July the 15th. In terms of business support, there have been $28.6 million in relief for small business grants and additional robust retail grants, $25 million in direct hospital assistance to district hospitals, $130 more in federal hospital assistance will flow to hospitals, and $11 million in federal funds to our locally federally qualified health centers and clinics. $13 million in district assistance to increase payments to home health aides and intermediate care facility providers, and then the district delayed sales tax payments, except for hotels, until July 20th, and property tax payments for hotels delayed until June 30th. $2.24 billion in federal Paycheck Protection Program assistance has been awarded, and then $78.2 million in federal economic injury disaster loans have also been awarded. This just gives you a sense of some of the other categories of federal assistance that we are awaiting, and some of which we have already received, most of which we're awaiting to receive from the federal government with associated guidance. So there's $17 million in rental assistance, $12.4 million that would go to the Housing Authority. There's federal assistance to owners of HUD-based projects for rental assistance, for supportive housing for seniors, supportive housing for people with disabilities. There's $2.3 million in utility assistance that will come additionally through the LIHEAP program. In the education and early child care space, there's $54 million in educational assistance that will flow to DC public schools and charter schools through OSSI. $11 million in additional assistance to the University of the District of Columbia, $6 million in child care assistance, and $1.2 million for the dislocated workers to get them back in the job market. In the nutrition space, there's continued assistance flowing through increased SNAP benefits and SNAP payments, resources for our local food banks, and money to support home-delivered meals to seniors. There's also federal unemployment assistance through July of 2020, and then $16 million in community services block grant to support vulnerable communities, and $2 million to support mental health and substance abuse disorders. Just to put into context those costs that we have experienced in addressing this pandemic, these represent categories of spending and costs that we have allocated from through the district government, either through our contingency cash or through the COVID state fund to support the pandemic. $43 million on PPE for enhanced cleaning and sanitizer and cleaning supplies. $100 million on medical supplies, equipment to help with our surge build out. $4 million on IT support. $6 million for hotels for quarantine. $20 million for call centers, equipment and food and more. $28 million for business assistance grants. $25 million for hospital assistance. We have $158 million allocated for costs for reopening, recovery, and relief. $100 million on contact tracing and increased testing. $223 million for public safety and frontline worker pay and overtime, and $32 million for healthcare contracts and increased rates for providers. We have talked many times about the COVID State Fund and the $495 million that's been allocated to DC and our need for the additional $755 million. So we want to just take a moment and show what we have allocated for the $495 million, and we have allocated every dollar of that COVID State Fund, and you can see those uses in the pie chart on the right where it says current uses. Pay and overtime for public safety, costs for DC to reopen, recover, and provide relief, the business and community group and hospital assistance grants, support for vulnerable families, contact tracing, IT support, healthcare delivery, personal protective equipment and cleaning and sanitizing, and medical surge. All of those activities we have utilized the $495 million for. The chart on the left, the items on the left, are the things that we still need to pay for, that we still need funds to support, which is why we need the $755 million, because we need additional PPE and we need physical build-outs and sanitizers and thermometers for when we begin to reopen various aspects of DC. We need people and equipment to screen individuals for symptoms. We need to assist businesses with buying PPE and making physical changes to their spaces. And also provide for enhanced cleaning. We need public spaces that will need barriers to help enforce social distancing, continued tracing and testing and treatment vaccinations when they become available. We need to anticipate costs for a second wave of COVID-19 spread. We need resources to support children and seniors and vulnerable adults who will need access to fresh, healthy food. We need residents. We know we have residents who will need digital access for learning, for healthcare visits, and for faith. residents who will need access to housing counseling, rental relief, housing supports, and affordable heating and cooling. And we know we have residents who will need continued unemployment assistance after additional federal benefits are set to run out in July and are time limited. So all of these activities are not sourced right now, and that COVID relief fund is a critical part of how we will recover and continue to provide relief in the District of Columbia. And so as we close, I think what we want to leave you with is that this budget, as challenging as it was to reduce spending by $700 million in the current fiscal year and cut $700 million from resources in fiscal year 21, this budget does invest in a gross funds basis $16.7 billion to give DC hope across all 8 wards. And so with that, Mayor, I turn it back over to you, subject to the questions.
Well done. You can breathe and take a drink of water and get ready for the questions. And I want to, again, thank you, CA, and thank the budget team, Jenny, for all of the work that you've done to bring us to this day. And we'll take your questions. Perry?
Thank you for that presentation. I have a question about early child care. A lot of daycares have told me that they fear they will be unable to reopen. And if they do, they'll be able to serve less students because of the health guidelines. Do you have a fear that there won't be enough early childhood seats when the city is ready to reopen? And if so, how are you hoping to alleviate that? And I'm unsure which seats, when Rashad mentioned a few seats, when those will be available.
Sure. So let me start by saying we are concerned about child care. We have, throughout this pandemic response, encouraged child care seats for essential workers and have supported child care seats for essential workers. We've also continued to pay our subsidy amounts to child care providers even though they're closed and not providing child care. So we have been making continued investments in our child care system. We also recognize that child care providers are businesses, and as we think about later stages of business relief, we are, of course, keeping our child care providers in mind as well as we craft different relief packages. So we also know that we're going to get on the other side of this pandemic, that we're going to continue to be a city that's growing and families looking for quality child care. Pre-pandemic, we recognized child care as a pinch point in our city that was going to hamper our growth if we didn't have quality, affordable child care seats across all 8 wards. So it was very important for us to continue to invest in that. So let me turn to Rashad and Jenny to add more about what this budget does.
Jenny, if you would.
So you had asked a question about the additional seats and when they would be available. So the budget invests funding to build out slots in 17 new schools across the city. The first set will be completed at the end of fiscal year 22, and then they'll sort of sequence out across the plan through FY26. Those schools with seats that will open in FY22 include Wheatley Elementary School, that will add 20 slots, Bunker Hill Elementary School, which will add 40 slots, Amadon Bowen will add 20 0 to 3 and 36 pre-K slots in 22. Drew Elementary School will add 20 slots in 2022, and Martin Luther King Elementary School will add 40 slots in 2022. And we can provide you a breakdown of all 17. Those are 0 to 3 slots, with the exception of Amadon Bowen, which will have 20 0 to 3 and 36 pre-K by 2022.
Yes, Martin.
So I know you guys constructed this budget and what kind of came from reserves, what came from surpluses, and that sort of stuff. We also know that there was kind of some small changes to some tax loopholes to kind of get some money there, but there's no significant changes otherwise on tax rates. Did that ever come into the debate? I know that you had said before that you can't raise $700 million just out of raising taxes. Well, you probably could, but it probably may not be a great idea. But was there any degree of tax
You said it.
No. Was there any degree degree of tax changes that were considered, and if not, why not?
Well, I think that you heard from the city administrator, we looked at all the tools at our disposal. We also looked at efficiency changes that we could make. We asked for a lot of sacrifice, or we are sacrificing a lot from our workforce as well. And we are still making very significant investments in schools, in health, and in how we will continue to grow as a city. So I think that we had the tools that we needed. Any other? Yes?
In going over the different kinds of reserve funds, the city administrator, you said that you didn't anticipate tapping into the emergency reserve, but it says on the slide that you typically tap into the emergency reserve fund when the contingency cash runs out. Doing some quick math, it looks like there's about $60 million left in the contingency cash fund. Can you explain how you're able to say that you won't use the $60 million?
Sure. Happy to answer that question. Every year when we propose the budget, we have a supplemental budget for the current year that we're in. And we use contingency cash every year. Every single year we use it. This year is no exception. We're using it a bit more, but we pay that back in the supplemental. So in the fiscal year 20 supplemental that also goes to the council, we will be paying back a significant portion of that contingency reserve that we have drawn down, using both local resources as well as federal resources that we will get reimbursements for the COVID-related expenditures.
Yes, James?
Mayor, I have two questions. One for possibly Jenny Reed and the other for Mr. DeWitt. Ms. Reed, in terms of the Summer Youth Employment Program, how much is allocated for that, if anything?
So the Summer Youth Employment Program, in the current fiscal year, we did not make any reductions to the program. I know the mayor will be discussing with the public later this week plans for that program. And then in fiscal year 21, we did make some small efficiency reductions in like vacant positions and some extensions that we've been able to grant students before. But that was a key priority for us to maintain that program.
Mr. DeWitt, the district, as you well know, they do a 4-year budget plan. And the talk is that the economy is supposed to turn around in 2021. Could you just give us a sense of what happens if the economy does not turn around in 2021 and things get worse for 2022 and 2023?
So when you look at the revenue forecast we talked about a little bit ago, we have the economy beginning to turn around in 2021 and really not getting to a strong recovery in 2022. So we have a U-shaped recovery. We go down, we're down for a little while, and then we go up. It's more like a Nike swoosh kind of pattern. So we're assuming that we begin recovery in the fall, and it goes through 2021. That's why 2021 has that $770 million reduction in it, and the really recovery begins in 2022. I think what you heard from the city administrator and from the mayor is, we did a budget based upon our best estimate of where revenues are going. We will do a additional forecast in August to see where we are, to see if we're opening and how the economy is recovering. But I think what you see in this budget is a use of tools that a healthy, financially strong city can do. We have, the $3.3 billion of reserves that was talked about. When you look at the 4-year plan, and I also want to make the point that most cities in the country budget 1 year. Under the Home Rule Act, we budget 4 years. So we're looking, what does it take to be sustained in the long run? And we'll reforecast that going forward. But we've used, if you look at the $3.3 billion reserves, we're using about $1.2 billion of them during the financial planning period, prudently. We're using the ones that we need that are available for a rainy day, that can still keep you at that AAA credit rating, but we're not using the emergency. We're not using the contingency. It's going to be full through the supplemental budget. We're going to have the cash flow reserve there to manage the cash flow. So we will still have resiliency built in there. And if you want to keep your strong credit rating that allows you to have an almost $8 billion capital budget, you have to do that. But you also have to do it for the very question you ask. What if it gets worse? What are you going to do? We'll still have arrows in the quiver, so to speak, to handle it if it gets worse. This is what a well financially managed city does. So I would say, you know, in the certification of this budget and looking at how we used reserves, how we used the federal funds where appropriate, how we used, you know, the things like foregoing pay increases for a period of time, how we looked at the federal grants, all that, we used every tool that's in the toolbox for a recession planning period and maintain resiliency for the very point you asked. What if it gets worse? How are you going to manage through it? And so I think we've had the CA and Jenny and I had late night discussions till 11:30 at night, some evenings, of going through and doing this budget. And what if it gets worse? What are we going to do? We've thought about that too. We'll be fine.
Yes, Paul.
Mayor, for anybody who can answer this, on page 18 it says fiscal year 2020 made 190 million in reductions to agency budgets, mostly through the hiring and spending freeze. What does mostly mean? Does that mean layoffs?
No. Oh, sorry, Mayor.
Go ahead.
It does not mean layoffs. It is. We just used the term mostly in case there's one other thing that isn't related to the agency budget there. But essentially, the 190 million came from agency budget reductions through the hiring freeze and the non-personnel services freeze. None of that included any layoffs that makes up that 190.
My follow-up is fiscal year 2021. It says made 166 million in reductions to agency budgets, including cutting all pay increases. Does that mean under bargained union contracts as well?
Yes.
So whatever the firefighters and the police officers have bargained for, they will not get those increases?
Well, the police and the fire, their contracts expired with us in 2020. So they don't have a contract, a wage contract for 2021 that has yet been agreed to or approved. So we are ready to be in negotiations with police, fires, and teachers now, as all three of those contracts expired in 2020, and they don't have active CBAs, collective bargaining agreements, going into 2021. However, there are other unions for which we do have a collective bargaining agreement that does cover a wage increase for fiscal year 2021 that we, through this budget and through the legislation going to council, will be setting aside. Compensation units 1 and 2, which is a group of 3 different unions that, for purposes of negotiation, come together. It's AFSCME, AFG, AFGE, and NAGE, NAGE. Those 3 unions come together to form compensation units 1 and 2 that cover about 12,000 district government employees. SCIU 1199E, which is a 35-unit person at the Department of Behavioral Health, and then AFSCME's 2921, which are paraprofessionals at DCPS. Those 3 unions have collective bargaining agreements with us in fiscal years 21.
So could I follow up on that, City Administrator?
Yeah.
So can we first look at 20, at fiscal year 20, and can you help me with the distinction between COLA and STEP?
Sure.
And kind of explain to me, I know you said no COLA, but what about STEP, and what about the collective bargaining agreements that are in effect for 2020?
So the way we have budgeted for steps, we will continue to budget for. Step increases, which are increases within a given classification for a given employee that is represented, agencies budget and have to absorb that cost within their agency. So we made no change to that practice. In fiscal year 2021, if an employee is due a step increase, the agency will have to absorb that cost like they always do and move that step increase forward. Correct, Director? Yes.
So for 20, they've already received their step increases if they would do that? So there wouldn't be anybody getting one between now and the end of 20?
Speak to 20.
Yes, in most cases, it depends on the timing, right, of the employee's tenure, but there's not been a change to step increases for 2020. What we've frozen is like pay raises outside of that step process, and what's been changed in 21 are pay raises outside of that step process.
Now, to the second part of your question, a COLA, a cost of living adjustment for represented employees, must be bargained for. And so that would be reflected in their collective bargaining agreement with the district as to what that COLA is. So for fiscal year 2020, all COLAs were paid to all represented employees, and non-represented employees follow what compensation units 1 and 2 would receive. So non-union employees also received a COLA in fiscal year 20. And every union that had an agreement with us that called for us to pay a COLA in 20, we will pay that. In fiscal year 2021, those COLAs that have been negotiated are in 3 unions: Compensation 1 and 2, SCIU 1199E, and AFSCME 2921. Those 3 units, we are setting aside that negotiated COLA, as well as for non-represented employees, they will not receive a COLA either through this 2021 and the rest of the financial plan.
So you're going to just setting that aside, right? So is that something you have to go back to the unions to do, or is that something you can legislate with the council and do it as an emergency?
A little bit of both. We talked to the unions, and I have talked to every impacted union about this decision. But the way that we effectuate that is through legislation that the mayor is providing through this budget to the council.
I appreciate that.
Yep.
Alex Coma.
Hey, can you all hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Fantastic. Mayor, I've heard you mention a few times now that you were certainly hoping to add more money to the HPTF and instead find yourself in a position where you're going in the other direction. And speaking with developers before the budget was released, many of them had expressed hope that they would see that $116 million remain, reasoning that even if it stayed at $116 million, it still necessarily wouldn't keep up with demand in the city, describing it as pent-up demand for new housing. So I guess what is your message to developers now who are anxious to move ahead with projects but will necessarily have less money to do so? Is it simply, wait until times are better? What can you tell them?
Well, I am confident that our development community, especially our affordable housing development community, is very creative. They have looked to every tool in the toolbox to get things done. We continue a $100 million commitment to HPTF, which I know many people don't remember, but when I became mayor, we were spending, I think, somewhere south of $70 million in HPTF. I made the commitment that no matter what the revenues coming in were, that we would use our general funds to spend $100 million. And over the years, we have grown that. We've added a housing preservation fund, which helps developers leverage private dollars into our developments as well. So not only do I wish we could have had the $116 million, I was hoping actually this year that we would make it even more. But this is where we are. And everybody, as I think I said at the beginning, is sacrificing something. And our commitment to getting to our units, though, remains, and we will continue to look as the economy improves on how we can amp up this investment. But to maintain a $100 million housing production trust fund continues to make us, I think, peerless among cities across the nation, and I dare say among states.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bennett? Washington.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I have 3 questions. The first one's quick. When the city administrator mentioned setting aside negotiated COLAs, does that mean that you're going to be paying it in fiscal year 2021 or not paying it?
We will not be paying it. Let me just say a little bit more, because what we're saying here is not insignificant, and we recognize that it's not insignificant. We have over 37,000 people who work for us, and district government employees have helped us be a city where people want to live, do business, recreate, go out to entertainment, and enjoy the arts. District employees are a huge part part of the comeback of Washington, D.C., and will be a part of the next comeback of Washington, D.C. as our economy improves. And we have made every effort in this budget to maintain the stability of our workforce. I was asked about layoffs, and we've been asked about furloughs, and we've been asked about rifts and mass cuts across the district, and we've been able to avoid that. But what we have asked our employees is with this budget, and what we will send to the council is, in order to keep the team together that's brought the district here, we're going to have to make some sacrifices there. And so we will not, throughout this plan, be increasing pay. But we do not have mass layoffs here. We do not have furlough days here. And what we have asked our employees to do is work with us while the economy comes back. And the legislation we will also send to the council, it indicates that if our economic indicators improve and improve vastly, that we will first revisit those contracts, those agreements that we have made, keeping in mind that all of the agreements that we make are based on having money available to support them. And so this is one such instance where we need to be able to make the investments to keep our government going. But if those indicators changed, even in this budget proposal in 21, we can come back and make good on those plans.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. As I was watching this budget presentation, I was just wondering more, how is it the city is able to have so much new spending given how much you had to cut, how much of the reserves you had to tap? I'm just struggling to understand the math here, how you're able to have a 3% increase in the new hospitals and all these other goodies given the situation the city's budget was in.
I don't know if I would refer to investing in public education as a goodie. I would refer to it as a must. And you have heard me say 1,000 times, if one, that our investments in public schools and in public safety led to the renaissance of Washington, D.C. And our public schools and our children, our teachers, our staff, everybody are in a none of us want them to be in a modified learning environment. We want them to be at school. But we also know that they're going to be coming back. And when they come back, we want to send a clear message to them and to their families that their schools are going to be ready, and we're not going to take a single step back from public education. It was also important for us, not only in the per pupil funding increase, but in also looking at long discussed projects to address overcrowding in part of our city, to have a permanent home for the Excel Academy, and also to have an innovative new structure at Spingarn to bring that building back, have our infrastructure academy there, and a possible partnership with a charter school is going to be a significant win-win for our city. The hospital you refer to also been long planned, and the council some years ago, I think with Council Member Gray's leadership, put the capital funding in for this project. I guess it's been maybe 4 years, 4 years that those funds have been in place. We have been working on, we set a goal to get the district out of operating hospitals, which we have done with our partnership with the George Washington Hospital, which is very significant. What's additional here, I think, is the ambulatory center that is funded. We won't change the trajectory of health outcomes for African Americans by building hospitals alone. We have to make sure that there is an integrated system, including ambulatory care, which will be at the St. Elizabeth's Hospital. We were also proud a few weeks ago to be here with the president of Howard University and of Adventist Healthcare. Howard University is also moving with a partner to rebuild their hospital, and the district is going to be an investor in that. This budget includes capital investments on the DDOT level for the campus, and it looks forward to other tax incentives later to help support that. All of that right now, when we're talking about the disproportionate impact on COVID in communities of color, these investments amplify the disparities in health outcomes, but also give us vehicles, very good vehicles, to change them. Yes.
Thank you. And my last question is about reserves.
Yeah.
Earlier, CFO DeWitt mentioned that we have sufficient reserves if we have a second wave of infections and things get worse for the city budget. Can he expand on that? Because my understanding from the presentation is that we're nearly exhausting several of the sources of reserves for both the fiscal year 20 and 2021 budgets.
And I will turn to the CFO certainly, and I think you may have missed when he said that we would completely repay the contingency cash reserves, and many sources of that we think will come from refunds. Is that the word I want? Reimbursements related to COVID, which is a good thing. And the cash flow reserve we will be using, but that's also replenished throughout the year. Fiscal stabilization is the fund that we will use to balance over the 4 years. Let me turn to Jeff.
Yes, just to follow up on that. So if you look in the volume 1 of the book that's online, you'll see the financial plan in the book. And you'll see the use of reserves, and you'll see toward the bottom of that table, I believe it's table 2-1, you can see the reserves where they are. The point I was making earlier, when we close 21, over a year from now, the only thing that won't be full under the plan is the fiscal stabilization reserve. And so we'll have the liquidity we need to manage the day-to-day operations that Rashad talked about in detail. We'll have an emergency fund for an emergency. We'll have the contingency fund to deal with the uncertainties that happen every year in our budget. And the fiscal stabilization fund will have been tapped, but it also gets repaid in the financial plan at the end of the plan as if economy is projected to recover. And obviously it recovers earlier. The way that works, it would get full earlier. But when you look at, and I think this is a really important point for people to understand, we have over $3 billion in reserves that we've been using every year. We had budgeted last year a significant amount of use of those reserves to balance the budget, but thank goodness for 2019, because what 2019 did is it gave us that additional $362 million. It gave us some other areas that we are tapping in this year. So we're using the same amount of reserves as last year, plus all the benefits we got in 2019. And the plan responsibly gets you back to where you started as the economy recovers. So, and this is incredibly important. There is an article this morning in the Bond Buyer that was talking about cities able to borrow, and we have an $8 billion program. And the ones that are really favored are what are called essential service credits, the water utilities, the electric utilities, and a select number of AAA cities or AAA governments, because a lot of cities are stressed and their budget's going to look a lot worse than what you saw in this presentation today. And the comment we got from bankers last week is we are in that select group of people that are going to be favored when we need to go borrow, which will allow us to do the emergency or the accelerated refinancing of our debt of $80 million that's used to help balance 20 and 21 to fund almost an $8 billion capital program. So we are using our reserves, but when you look at the plan, and I encourage you to look at that table, you'll see there's a significant use, but there's also a rebuilding and maintaining of those to a level that gets you to a quality credit that allows us to do things that are helping us balance the budget. The better off you start, the better you're going to get through this. And I think we started as well as we possibly could. So very comfortable in this credit and in this budget from the perspective of being able to maintain that, which we need to do to get through this, because there are uncertainties and we may need to borrow through the period and all those types of things, and we'll still have access to that.
Thank you. Tom Sherwood.
Thank you very much, Mayor. I have one question for you and then one question for the CFO, if you don't mind.
Of course.
The question to you is, the city administrator has said that everyone needs to share in the burden for cuts. What is, if you can, tell me, what is the cut for the overall executive office of the mayor, your offices? What is that?
Sure.
And shall I wait for my CFO question?
Yes, let me ask Jenny to let you know.
Yes, there is a reduction in the thank you. There's a reduction in the mayor's office in FY20 of $700,000. And then there is a reduction of 1.23 million if you compare the 20 approved to the 21 revised budget in the mayor's office.
I'm sorry, I don't understand that second part of the answer. I understand clearly 700 million in 2020. How much in 2021?
The 21 budget is $1.23 million less than the 20 budget. So 1.23 million.
So overall, that's almost it. Okay, never mind. Let me go to the CFO. Thank you. I've heard the CFO talk about the bond rating and the various emergency funds. Some candidates for the council, some members of the council may say spend more of the reserves. What is the threat to the city's bond rating if the district is not careful with its reserves?
We had a lot of discussions in the evenings, a lot of discussions about how much could you use, because and I think we're at the point where we're right at the right point where we can maintain the credit and still have the benefit of that. So I think if you got too aggressive in that, like you decided to not repay the contingency or dip into the cash flow, you would lose your credit rating, because reserves are one of those issues. And what's the value of that? If we didn't keep our credit rating, we couldn't refund $80 million. We wouldn't be able to get that refinancing savings. And then that would be an additional hit on the budget. If we didn't keep our credit, we would have to cut at least $500 million to $1 billion more out of the capital program, because the debt service would be higher. If we didn't keep our credit and we didn't have enough cash, we might have to short-term borrow. And then when you borrow short-term, you have to pay it back. So we literally have a budget that uses the reserves appropriately and gives the government the maximum amount of resources it could possibly get to try to manage through this and doing it in an optimal way. So I think we're at the point where additional use without repayment would put us at risk, but we're at the point where we can do that and get all the benefits that gives you, that gives us more resources to have less impacts on the district's programs and things we want to do.
Thank you.
Martin?
Just back to the CFO, one thing that has come up is that the status of the paid family leave program is still kind of in flux, that your office is still looking at the $300+ million in the fund to see if it's enough to cover the first year benefits. Can you just talk about how quickly that decision will be made, and what's the mechanism if you guys do the math and say it's not going to cover benefits? Does it just automatically delay? Do you have to go back to the council? Just talk through how this is going to work.
So we have had meetings with DOES and discussions with them as we look at the program. As you mentioned, there's 300 some million in the fund. So we are in the process of looking at that along with DOES. We'll be meeting in the coming weeks to determine if we turn it on. There is the revenues are about the amount we expected, but if you turn it on, will it be able to sustain itself? Because you don't want to turn it on and then shut it off shortly after because it's overwhelming itself. So we expect to have that in the coming weeks. In time for enough. We'll make that determination in a few weeks, so that if it needs to go live on its due date, that there'll be adequate time to do that. So sometime late this month or early June, we will, with DOES, look at that and make a recommendation. The way that law works is we have to certify that the funds are adequate to start. And so we would be advising the council and the mayor on that particular issue. Again, we want to make sure when you turn it on that it works. And if it doesn't get to the point immediately, as long as the revenue keeps coming in, it would get there, I would say probably shortly after that. But we will tell you early June at the latest, maybe earlier. We're working on that right now as to what the draws are going to be on that fund as it turns on.
Did that change at all because of the pandemic? Does it change your thinking in terms of how many people you assume could start taking benefits?
That's exactly what we're analyzing. We're saying, okay, what's the draw on that fund going to be in the pandemic? Because when it was designed, I think, 4 years ago? This is a different world, and so what are the draws going to be? They may be more, they may be less. We're trying to figure all that out. given all the other things that are out there.
There's been lots of different scenarios depending on where we are in the fall, how schools could operate, whether that be staggered schedules, all these things. Do you anticipate a scenario in which schools are significantly more expensive to operate just based on health logistics? And if so, how does the budget account for that?
We don't know yet, Perry. We do know that some things will be more expensive that are fairly obvious. Modifications to buildings if necessary, increase sanitation if necessary. Our teams are continuing to look at that, and we we will make necessary investments from our COVID relief fund.
Barry last in February said that DCPS would give $3.5 million in stabilization funds in terms of enrollment if a school is under-enrolled. Does that still stand?
Yes.
3.4 million still?
Yes.
Okay. Phil?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I don't know if you want to answer this now or tomorrow when there's the hearing, but Councilmember Trayon White asked for more information regarding BARD, and Councilmember Mary Che asked for more information regarding the Foxhole School. Can you give more information today and then be prepared for questions tomorrow?
Yes.
Sure. So I can talk a little bit about BARD. So there's an $80 million investment.
Microphone, Jenny.
Oh, thank you. I can talk a little bit about BARD and Foxhall. So then BARD Early College, there's an $80 million investment to create a permanent home. It'll be at the current site of the Malcolm X Opportunity Center, and we'll begin design and construction in 21 and wrap up in fiscal year 23. And if you give me a sec while we're talking, I'll pull up Foxhall as well, which will be built on the site of the old Hardy School in the sort of lower portion of Ward 3. And that funding is spread across FY22 to 24, and I'll get you the breakout in just a second.
And while she's looking at for the exact amount, so the idea with Foxhall is to relieve some of the pressure in the elementary school system, and I think Jenny, correct me but we were looking at the population at both Key and Stoddard and how to relieve some of the pressure in those two schools. And what we found is that it's more efficient and probably a greater solution, a better solution to create a new elementary school at Foxhall, which will relieve some of that elementary school pressure that we were seeing in Key and Stoddard. And there perhaps is a third school that we think it could be impacted by a new Foxhall that will just allow more growth for students to have more choice about where they're going in that elementary school network.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, can you share your thoughts or reactions to the budget?
I think that as it's been presented, that it's a very good budget. I can't speak for all the members, and we will have 2 months of, well, that's not quite right. We'll have over a month of hearings. Public hearings start later this week. The first is tomorrow with just the mayor and the city administrator and the chief financial officer, but the committees start right after that. We went into this, I think everybody, when I say we, I'm talking about the public, you all, the government, the council members, expecting that there's going to have to be a lot of pain. And while I think that when we look at the details, we will still see that there have been some trimming in agencies that we may have some concerns about, that overall, I mean, when you look at the big moves here, that what has been presented solves the problem being for the first time in maybe a decade where we've seen substantial drop in revenues, that the big moves are solving that problem. And doing it in a way that at the same time meets a lot of concerns that we knew would be coming forward, like education. And the fact that there's some additional investments in education in spite of $750 million drop in revenues is a good thing.
If I can go back to Councilmember Che's question For Foxhall, exactly, there's $3 million in fiscal year 23, $35.4 million in 24, $17.8 million in 25, for a total of $56.3 million in the capital improvement plan.
Mark?
I have a couple more budget questions, and then I had a couple of COVID non-budget. If we hold that to the end, is that what you want to, can you, I know last night in our briefing you had mentioned, City Administrator, that there were 14 positions that were going to be eliminated, but I understand that that number may be a little bit higher. Could you give us that number? And also, are there any hirings in this budget that you create new positions where you're actually hiring people?
So I'll answer the second question first. There is in the budget about 515 positions in the local fund that are created. 421 of those relate to DCPS. There's about 12 or 14 related to OSSI, and those are in special education. Then MPD has some increases. I believe they're 42 for MPD, 38 for DOES, and that's related to paid family leave. And then there are 36 for the Office of the Attorney General.
That gets us to 515.
I didn't add it up. I gave you the bigger buckets. I gave you the largest ones.
And then the RIFs?
So there are 14 positions, 10 in the Department of Health that were contemplated prior to the pandemic, related to the HOSTA agency. That's the agency that works on HIV issues and sexually transmitted diseases. And there are 4 related in OCTO related to the DC-1 card. There are a set of employees in DCPS, and let me just talk about how the DCPS process works. When the mayor sets the budget for DCPS, there's then an allocation of budgets to schools. Historically, and this year included, school leaders have the discretion to assign personnel or structure their staffing as they see fit. They may say, I want one less custodian because I want one more office aide, or I'll take 2 registrars, and so I'm willing to forego 2 of the secretarial staff support or paraprofessional staff. So school leaders have the autonomy to structure their personnel within their school-based budget, and they do that every year. Last year, for example, we shifted around a number of custodians because of school-based decisions that school leaders have. So there are employees in DCPS that are support staff related in the school building, behavioral techs, secretary assistants, for example, that individual schools have made decisions around that staffing complement. Those individuals, DCPS, the central office and schools are working to place all of those. So I view that a little bit different than the RIFs that I talked about of the 14, but there are employee displacements and employee moves in DCPS by virtue of building principals making staffing decisions as they historically do. And so DCPS centrally will work with those school leaders to reposition that staff in available schools across the system.
Did I understand that you're talking about repaying the contingency fund in 4 years? I thought it was required in 2 years.
The contingency reserve in the budget is paid at the end of, in the supplemental budget the mayor is doing it at the end of this fiscal year. A lot of it's coming from the federal funding that reimburses it.
Fiscal stabilization.
Okay, yes, thank you, I appreciate that.
Yeah, fiscal stabilization fund is repaid at the is repaid at the end of the financial plan. So it's paid back in 23, 24. I'm sorry?
That's in 4 years?
It will be used in 2021 and paid back in 23 and 24 in the plan. There is not a 2-year requirement to pay that one back.
There's not a 2-year requirement. And then have you factored in, or what number have you factored in for non-payment of property tax when the next bills come due?
We have a percentage in the revenue forecast you saw had some assumptions in there about certain levels of business is not coming back on the restaurant side. I think we talked about 20% of that in the longer run, and then being some difficulty for some areas like hotels paying. So that's all factored in to the revenue on which the budget's based.
Can you give us that number? What percentage you think won't pay? Won't pay?
You know, it would not be surprising to see a 5 to 10% delinquency, at least temporarily, on property taxes. But as you know, over time, property taxes have to be paid because they're part of the lien on the property that gets placed on those. So when they get sold, they get paid then in the long run. But a lot of our property taxes, and we were finding that we didn't have hardly any non-payments in March when they came in, because a lot of those are paid through the mortgage companies. And so, you know, those are set aside monthly. So the banks are not going to let the properties not pay the property taxes because they don't want to, they got the loans out on the property. So that does result in less of a delinquency than you might think.
Thank you.
Yep.
Non-budget questions. We got the news today that it seems to be good news. Can you I appreciate Dr. Nesbitt's not here, but that the most recent numbers is that there's an 8-day now downward curve.
Let me
trend
switch
curve.
folders for a second.
Thank you. And I'm just wondering, if that seems like good news. And
I say it's good news. So let me give you some COVID numbers. Yesterday, let me make sure I'm on the right day here. Yes. So yesterday we had 147 cases reported. Sadly, 9 people succumbed to the virus. A total of 7,270 cases, and a total of 392 Washingtonians have died. And we also have report a sustained decrease in community spread for 8 days, and also a transmission rate below 1 for greater than 3 days. And we continue to have our hospital usage trending in the right direction as well. So we're on track.
So what does that mean to people who are keeping track and are hoping that maybe you may be able to revisit June 8th?
It means that we are 8 days towards 14 days of decreased transmission, that our testing and hospital usage is also on track, and I think also our tracing capability is almost where we need it to be. So on Thursday, we will be talking about our sector plans. Let me thank the CFO DeWitt and Chairman Mendelson for being a part of the Reopen DC Steering Committee. They have been hearing from the committees over the last week about phasing, about how businesses are reopening and how various parts of our community and economy will reopen. And that will put us even closer by Thursday, barring some unforeseen spike, to be able to talk a little bit about more when we can begin a phased reopening.
And then my last question, I very much appreciate it. There's now been some reporting on the Abbott testing's reliability and accuracy being called into question, and I believe that's one of the mechanisms, tests that the district has been using and putting out to some of the long-term care facilities and whatnot. What have you guys done in response to those reports? Have you been tracking that? Are you concerned? Are we still using that?
Dr. Nesbitt has, and I'll wait for her to give a report out on anything that she's found or recommended changes. Yes. Yes, sir.
You talk about in the budget that you want to renovate, provide renovations to the DC jail. During your discussions with your staff, Mayor Bowser, has there been any talk about a new DC jail?
We have, over several years, looked at how to replace the DC jail. We've undergone a series of conversations, I think, led by our Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants. I don't know, Rashad, if you have the latest on what they came back to us with. But we do not have in this budget, nor the debt capacity to build a new jail in this budget. But we continue to make a very significant investment in making sure that the one that we have is safe, that all the systems work, that we continue to be able to use excess space in the jail for preparing people for reentry as well. Okay, is that it? All right, thank you, everybody. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.